Here, of course, we come to the final function of fantasy, the consolation of the happy ending, which, far from being accidental, is essentially to fantasy and a logical, even necessary outcome of recovery and escape. It is consolation insofar as good fantasy shows us that, far from being a species of wishful thinking, hope for a happy ending is grounded in a true and deep understanding of reality itself. This wonderful quote is from a fantastic new book, and I am thrilled to have the author here with us on the podcast today. Welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. We have Dr. Robert Dobie here to talk about the fantasy of J.R.R. Tolkien, Mythopoeia, and the recovery of creation. Dr. Dobie is professor and chair of philosophy at LaSalle University, author of Thinking Through Revelation, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian Philosophy in the Middle Ages, along with several other books. Today, we're discussing his book, The Fantasy of J.R.R. Tolkien. Dr. Dobie, thank you for joining us on the So We Speak podcast.
Well, thanks, Cole. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
You know, one of the things that readers will immediately pick up in this book is just the depth of engagement with Tolkien. It's not just Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I mean, we're going deep into what Tolkien wrote, his letters, the things that were edited after his death by his son, and then the engagement with Tolkien's scholars. There's a tremendous amount of breadth in the scholarship here. So I just have to ask, how did you encounter Tolkien? And then how did you get into the scholarly side of J.R.R. Tolkien's work?
Yeah, well, geez, I remember very early, I started reading Tolkien. Of course, I'm going to date or age myself. This is as a 12-year-old in the late 70s. I remember picking up. I mean, I remember there was, there was a fellow student in grade school whom I admired as being kind of the smartest kid in the school. And he was really into the Lord of the Rings, I remember. And their family dog was even named Gandalf, I remember. And I just said, I got to read this, because it had to be cool. This had to be a really cool thing to know and read. And so I was at my local mall and I picked up a copy of the Fellowship of the Ring, and I went home and I started reading it. And I think I read through the night, and I kept reading and reading, and I ended up reading the whole Lord of the Rings over the course of 7th grade. And then when summer vacation came on, I read it again. And then I read The Hobbit, and then I read the Tolkien Reader, and I tried reading the Silmarillion, but that didn't go as well as the others. So,
Yes.
And I didn't really actually ended up reading that until finished reading it until 20 years later. But it was just like a foundational part of my teen years. And I just became absolutely enchanted by Middle Earth. And what I like to call the numinous quality of that setting. There just seemed to be something really, I mean, almost like a tangible, magical quality to it that not only transformed my imagination, but even transformed the world around me. I mean, I was, the woods near my house in suburban Pennsylvania or suburban Philadelphia became kind of like almost like a version of the Old Forest or Lorien or whatever. And I just remember, it just so enriched. I remember the work so enriching my imagination and really re-enchanting the world for me, which just left an indelible impression. But I mean, with college and then graduate school and a career as a young academic, I just kind of forgot about Tolkien. Not completely, but it just kind of receded into the background. And it was really the Peter Jackson movies that reignited my interest, and of course we could come back to my opinion of the movies,
Sure.
but I will. But overall, I mean, they did really reignite my interest. And my wife, who we had just gotten married at the time, and my wife is like, why didn't you teach a course on Tolkien now that you? It's like, no, I love Tolkien, but it's not really my area of expertise, and so forth. But after a couple of years, I finally decided, I'm going to do it. And so I offered a course called J.R.R. Tolkien as Philosopher at my university. And I had the time of my life teaching that course. It was like and the students were just amazing, that I get, which I can't say I know not every there's never a lot of courses don't have the same level of interest from
Sure.
students, and certainly like introductory courses you get a lot of students who are not really who a lot of whom are tuned out and so forth. But the Tolkien classes, everyone was interested, and it was just teaching it was just absolutely a blast. And as I mentioned before, it was in the course of teaching that course that I became familiar with all the unpublished works, the secondary literature, the scholarship on Tolkien, and then just the idea for the book just emerged organically, really, from that course.
Yeah. Well, you can tell, having taught as well. When I read a book, I can always tell when somebody's field tested these ideas.
Right.
They've anticipated the critiques, they've thought of the back and forth, and this one you get exposed not just to the things that probably any reader loves about Tolkien. If they're a Tolkien fan, you're going to get that, but you're actually going to get the whole broad world of Tolkien and his writings.
Yeah.
You write in the preface. This is so in line with what you just said about when you discovered Tolkien, and it comes through in the book. You say in the preface, "The world I stepped into upon reading this book gave me such a frisson of the numinous that I could not put it down." So once I looked up the word frisson, and it's like goosebumps,
Yeah. Yeah. A
but it points
shudder.
to something so true, and I think almost everybody probably has this experience when they read Tolkien. Is you do feel like you're reaching out to touch something even realer than the real world. And what
Yeah.
is it about that? I think that's the
Exactly.
quest. What is it about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think Kraft really puts it well when he says it's like no one ever says that such and such when they read the Lord of the Rings. Oh, uh, such and such in the real world reminds me of. Wait. How does he put it? He says it's always the case that when we look at the world around us, it reminds us of something in the Lord of the Rings, but
Mhm.
it's never the reverse.
Right, right.
Something in the Lord of the Rings reminds us of something in our
Yeah.
primary world, as Tolkien puts it. And so that kind of points to the fact that, in many ways, what Tolkien is revealing to us is truth.
Yes.
The what it, or the truth behind, or the truth, the creative truth behind the world, you might say.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a window into, who was it, Chesterton, that wrote about, sailing away and thinking you're going to a brand new world, but then you come to your world, and because you think it's new, you're seeing it completely differently. And
Exactly.
I loved that this is one of the central themes in your
Yeah.
book, is talking about this very principle of Tolkien writes these, what we think of as fairy stories,
Right.
not
Right.
in the real world, quote unquote, real
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then it changes the way we see the world.
Right.
And it
Exactly.
takes a real master to do that. I wanted to unpack this idea a little bit. You start out with a short story that Tolkien wrote in the late 1930s, published in 1945, called Leaf by Niggle.
Hmm.
And it's not one that's as well known to
Right.
Tolkien
Yeah.
fans, but it's kind of this paradigmatic lens to see Tolkien and his work. Tell us a little bit about that story and what it and how it helps us to understand what's happening in Tolkien's writing.
Well, I think it was significant. That short story was significant for Tolkien because apparently he was suffering a great deal of writer's block. He was writing the so-called, at the time it was called, the Hobbit sequel, which of course later became Lord of the Rings. And he kind of, after the first couple chapters, he kind of was in a he was in an impasse. He just didn't know where the story was going. And then he had this dream, which is the story of Leaf by Niggle, which he then wrote in apparently one sitting. He wrote the whole short story in one sitting about this painter called Niggle who's trying to finish this painting. This starts off with a leaf, but then it grows into a tree and then to a whole landscape with mountains in the distance and so forth. And he's pressed for time. He knows he needs to make a needful journey, which is death. Um, but of course, he never finishes his work, and he goes to what is kind of like a purgatorial workhouse where he has to, in a sense, um, let go of his artistic ambitions in a way, and also just let go of time itself, and just attend to what is before him. And then, of course, he is released from this purgatorial workhouse, where he meets his neighbor Parish, who in life had been really annoying and had not really recognized his artistic gifts. But now he discovers that the two of them are now working together. He's become interested in Parrish's gardening, which was his main focus. And now Parrish is interested in Niggle's tree, which is now is a reality. He now sees that this tree that he's been trying to paint is now a real tree, which he says is a gift, you know. And then a shepherd comes to take them away to a even greater far green country beyond that, and so forth. And so, after this, apparently his writer's block just went away, and he was able to continue with the story. So, of the Lord of the Rings, and so I think that, and so that was a really significant story for him. But of course, there's all sorts of other themes in that story. Of course, it's not just that it helped him solve his writer's block, but also there's a lot of themes in there of time, of death, of a eucatastrophe, of a happy ending, of the relationship of art to reality, that I think are really important. Like, for example, the tree, the leaf, and then eventually the tree that Nigel is trying to paint actually turns out to be real. It's not just
Mhm.
it's not just something that is just not a figment of his imagination, but it's something that actually he finds is a real tree. That was his tree, so it wasn't some other tree, it was his tree, but now it's become a real living tree in which birds come to nest and so forth. Kind of reminds you of the parable of the mustard seed, in the
Yeah.
gospel, where, and so I really think that, and I think that's how Tolkien conceived his own work. I really thought that,
Yes.
um, uh, and I tend to think this, or I have great hope that Middle Earth is actually real. It's not
Yes.
just Middle Earth is not just a product of fancy or fantasy, so to speak. But I think Tolkien thought it was a real world. He even talks about how a lot of his writing he wasn't something like he invented or he came up with. He discovered the story, that the characters like Strider, in the chapter Strider came into the story,
Mhm.
unexpected and uninvited. And so I think Tolkien really believed that on a certain plane of existence, Middle Earth is like a real place, and
Yeah.
that we could go to it at some point. Um, yeah,
Yeah, in his letter, I think one of his letters, he says that it's actually, people conceive of it as a separate world, but he's kind of insisting, no, this is our world. It's just a different time,
yeah,
and that gives
yeah.
you a real insight into what he thought he was doing.
Exactly, yeah, and of course, he's very much interested in time travel as well, ancestral memory, and and perhaps this, existing Middle Earth existed in some sort of immemorial past, and he has all sorts of um, manuscripts that were published in the Histories of Middle Earth by his son Christopher, like the Notion Club papers and others, where he talks about, or the Cottage of Lost Play, where you have these characters trying to remember, particularly the fall of Numenor, which is kind of like an Atlantis
Hmm.
legend. And so, yeah, I mean, these were things that he really was interested in.
Yeah. So if this is kind of the narrative component that gives us
Mm-hmm.
unlocks a little bit of who he is and what he's doing, there's also an essay on fairy stories. That
Yeah.
he's talking maybe a little bit more directly about what he thinks the purpose of these stories are. And the two of those, you weave the two of these together in the opening sections of the book
Mm-hmm.
to kind of bring us to this theme of the book, which is recovery.
Right.
And that's this really wonderful but surprising theme that runs through the book is, oh, hold on, we're not just taking these as works of fiction. They're actually doing something to us, and they're helping us with something. Explain a little bit of recovery, in the book, but also as you see what Tolkien's doing with that theme.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. He talks about recovery as sort of cleaning the windows of our perception, which have become grimy and dirty from triteness and familiarity. We become so, the world around us becomes so trite and familiar that we don't really look at it carefully anymore. The world just simply, we look at the world simply as a means to an end, to something else, and so forth. Whereas what good art, and certainly what good fairy stories, what he calls fairy stories, what we would call fantasy, do is that they clean these windows. They allow, and they do so by giving us a world that's both simultaneously strange and familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very familiar in one respect. And so, for example, you have the Shire, which is a very sort of, very, which anyway, to the English would be a very familiar experience of the English countryside and so forth, and hobbits being sort of um, a version of rural, rustic English folk and so forth. But then, of course, the characters gradually move out of the Shire into a much stranger world, the Old Forest, and then Tom Bombadil, and then you go to Moria, and so forth and so on, Lothlorien. Um, and so and so you have this world that's also very strange, and particularly, like, for example, in the Old Forest or Fanghorn and other
Mm-hmm.
places like that. And this mixture of familiarity and strangeness, Tolkien thought, would allow us to see the world as if it were new, and therefore pay attention to its beauty, to its intelligibility, to its goodness, um, along, of course, with the evils that are involved thereby too. And I think for Tolkien, you really can't have a coherent notion of evil without a coherent notion of goodness, right? Or the fundamental nature of goodness. The world is fundamentally good, but of course marred in such a way that that you also have evil.
Yeah, a lot of that springs from Tolkien's faith, his Catholic faith,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
that's not always expressed overtly, but the book is deeply Catholic. It's a deeply
Hmm.
Christian book. How, in what sense is it Catholic? And two, I noticed you come as a philosopher and very
Hmm.
familiar with some of the same backdrop that Tolkien is writing from. How important is somebody like Aquinas for Tolkien, or maybe for readers of Tolkien to understand what he's doing?
Yeah, well, as far as the Catholic nature of the work, he specifically says that that it is a specifically Catholic work. Unconscious, he said in the beginning. So when he wrote it, he was just trying to write a good story. That's what. So he wasn't trying to write any sort of, certainly no sort of allegory, which which he denies, right?
Yes.
But he said explicitly so in the revision, right? As he saw the elements and revising it, he did see the elements of its Catholic nature. And of course, Christian too. Of course, I would say the two are the same, but he, but as far as like the more specific Catholic elements go, of course, you could point to Galadriel as a archetype of the Virgin Mary. Of the Blessed Mother, of course, Lembas, which is way bread, or Viaticum, as they
Hmm.
say in the Catholic Church, which is that of the Eucharist, which of course sustain, even though it did not, how should we say, he describes Lembas as not giving, not giving the satisfaction of sort of physical food and so forth, but it did give a power to the will to persevere beyond its natural strength and so forth. But I would say even more deeply and this is something that like scholars like Bernthal and others have pointed out, is the deeply sacramental nature
Hmm.
um, of Middle Earth. Right? In other words, the various elements have a spiritual nature, whether it's water, fire, and so forth, that convey meaning and convey grace, throughout the work. And so, in a way, Middle Earth is a way of sort of conveying a sacramental view of the world. That is, that the natural elements are not. We're not living in a disenchanted or mechanistic universe, but one in which each of the elements has more than just a symbolic nature, but has a sacramental nature. That is,
Hmm.
they convey they're vehicles of grace and power. And I think that's what you see throughout the throughout the story, certainly of the Lord of the Rings, and maybe to a lesser degree his other works, but certainly in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes. Now, one of the connections I saw that runs through the book is the topic of virtue. So when you have the recovery theme, and then to give people a sense of how the book is laid out, there's recovery through many of these chapters: creation,
Right.
language, fellowship, others
Hmm.
hope at the end.
Right.
And looking at each of these areas, and virtue comes up in several of these, and then you have the chapter on it. And
Right.
I think one of the things that people really like, especially as time is going on, what people really like about Lord of the Rings is it's a refreshingly clear moral universe. There's good
Right.
guys and
Yeah.
bad guys,
Yeah.
but it's not a simplistic moral universe,
Right.
as in all the
Right.
characters are really, when they're complex, they're, they feel like real people. They're not 100% good or bad, but what the good is and what the evil is,
Right.
and
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
keep the people on the right teams. Some of
Yeah.
this has to do with his vision for virtue. What are the virtues? Pity, forgiveness, you touch on those in the book. Is it safe to say Tolkien is not a utilitarian in terms of how he construes his
uh,
characters?
no, not at all. Yeah, he's. I mean, in many ways, the whole book is. I mean, I don't think he consciously was attacking utilitarianism,
Sure.
but just by virtue of, well, no pun intended, by virtue of his virtue ethics, it is anti-utilitarian because in many ways, actually, he you know time and time again in the book, whatever seems expedient actually ends up being disastrous, right?
Hmm.
And whatever ends up being non-expedient, actually, but virtuous, but good, ends up saving the quest. Of course, obviously, Bilbo's pity towards Gollum, right, as well as Frodo's pity, and so forth, and so those are just a couple of examples. And of course, you have the ring itself, right? I mean, if the ring itself, the utilitarian would just say use it,
Yeah.
because you could bring out, you could bring so much good out of it. But Tolkien is insistent that that a mere calculus like that is without being rooted in, I would say, eternal and unchanging values of goodness, is ultimately going to be destructive
Yes.
to the wielder and to the society, in which it is, well, in which for the benefit of which the bearer of the ring is supposedly working for. Um, so um, so yeah, I think and of course, for Tolkien, as Shippey and others have pointed out, pity is also a major virtue, and pity always seems to work against the person who is showing pity, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so there's this paradox there where the person who's showing pity is, in a sense, seemingly working against their own advantage,
Hmm.
whereas Tolkien shows, in a way that's very unexpected and very naturalistic, that's not that that doesn't happen. Actually, it rebounds to the benefit of the one who shows pity.
Yes.
And those who are all just about expediency, like Saruman, end up being destroyed by their own devices.
Yes. Yeah. What is that? You'll be able to quote this better than I would, but there's a Tolkien proverb that you quote in there about evil. Evil Mars itself. I can't
Yeah,
remember exactly what he's.
oft evil Mars, or oh god, I can't
Yeah,
quite
so
remember it too.
that's the
Yeah,
sense of it. Is yeah, in the Lord of the Rings specifically, you see that evil is allowed to look advantageous for a while, but it ends up undermining itself, which is a
yeah,
biblical theme. God,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
there's
yeah.
these stories of irony in the Bible, where the evildoer actually, like Haman, for example,
Right, right.
Haman
In
ends
the Book
up
of Esther,
dying
yeah,
on his own gallows that he builds, and so
yeah, yeah.
this happens, and this is a particular way of seeing good and evil and seeing virtue. To the extent, there are some utilitarians in the book. Boromir, who thinks, yeah, we'll just take it and use it. I
Right,
thought one of the things you point out that makes a lot of sense if you understand where Tolkien's coming from is, it never occurs to Sauron that they would try to destroy the ring.
right,
That's like
exactly.
the
Yeah,
plan, the contingency that he did not plan for
right,
is that
right.
they would want to destroy it.
Yeah, yeah. Evil doesn't understand good,
Right.
but good can understand evil, right? Because almost all the virtuous characters in the Lord of the Rings know their potential for evil, know
Yes.
what they are capable of. And maybe that's kind of the shortcoming of Boromir, for example, is
Right.
that he wasn't. And of course, for Tolkien, he makes a heroic end and redeems himself, but um, but he lacked that self-awareness. But all the other good characters, so that, I mean, precisely, actually, for Tolkien, the good characters have to can't be completely good, right? Because they
Hmm.
know that they have a potential
Right.
for being for falling, for being evil. And what distinguishes Sauron from them is that um, he has no self awareness in that sense. I mean, he just
Yes.
he thinks everyone makes calculations based on power, like
Yes.
he does, and he can't conceive. He just literally can't conceive of anyone making calculations based on what is not on power, but on what is genuinely and essentially good.
Yes.
And so this is a fatal, this is a fatal mistake that he makes.
Yeah, and you can see the characters that he corrupts the most start to follow
Hmm.
this thread. So the difference
Yeah.
between somebody like a Denethor, let's say, and a
Right.
Theoden, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
Denethor thinks he's wise, but he isn't.
Right. Exactly.
Thinks he sees, but he doesn't. And of course, Theoden has come out of this stupor, this
Right.
captivity,
Right.
and now he sees anew.
Yeah.
And he's
Yeah.
willing to be courageous and valiant because of it. Or a Gandalf
Exactly.
versus Saruman.
Right. Right.
They're divided in some ways by their ability to understand both themselves, their limitations, but also the nature of evil.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this fits into, the theme of recovery too, because I think this notion of virtue has become foreign to us in many ways in the modern world. I mean, I think we are by default utilitarians for the most part, whatever, as long as it does, as long as there's mutual consent and it doesn't harm anyone,
Exactly.
this is probably the universal fallback moral position of almost anyone. We might also, there might be a few Kantians out there too. We do things for the sake of duty, um, but but the whole notion of virtue is it does, and it does. I mean, I teach it all the time to my undergraduates, and it does have a foreign, almost archaic or quaint ring to them,
Hmm.
and so forth. But I think what Tolkien does in his work is that he makes it a living option.
Right.
We see it in action. And therefore it becomes something that we are attracted to and something that we try to imitate unconsciously, without thinking of it as virtue or virtue ethics. And
Yes.
so, in that sense, I think he is trying to recover the whole notion of virtue, and which is why I think, and I think I mentioned this in my book, why the Lord of the Rings is so despised by certain types,
Hmm.
particularly the literati and um, the postmodern sophisticates and so forth, precisely because it does unabashedly show us virtue, and this is supposed to be, from the postmodern standpoint, this is supposed to be a discredited, archaic system of, rooted in systems of oppression and so forth. Whereas I think for Tolkien, he shows how virtue is the only liberating thing for us. To the degree that we act virtuously, to that degree, we are not conditioned by our circumstances or systems of power or whatever. We actually are able to step out of them and actually act in a way that is truly free and truly uh, independent.
Hmm. It reminds me of the line, I think it's Aragorn, that says, some things are worth doing even when the ends are mysterious or unknown.
Exactly. And that's another thing. The utilitarian approach only works if you know all ends. If you know
Yes.
exactly what the consequences will be. I mean, because, for utilitarianism, what's good is what has good consequences. But how do we know that? I mean, we don't. And so what is it? I think Gandalf says only the wise, not even the wise know all ends. And so
Yes.
um, to, to base, to base our decisions on simple consequences or calculations of power or whatever is foolish.
Yes. Well, I wanted to zoom in on a couple of these topics, but I also wanted to give you a few rapid fire questions. I love when I get to talk to somebody that likes Tolkien, just to see. We did a series of 5 episodes on Tolkien, looking at his different works and looking at his life, and tried to answer some of these questions. So let me give you a few of these. What's your favorite Tolkien work that is not The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings?
Unfinished Tales,
Okay.
actually.
Which comes
That's
in a beautiful collection now.
Yeah, I was surprised when I read that. I thought, well, I think the title Unfinished is a little unjust to it. Actually, they are. I mean, they are more or less finished, and they're really, really interesting. I mean, they're great tales, and in that book, that volume after the Silmarillion, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, that I think that volume really gives you excellent insights into uh, Tolkien's world and his conceptions behind it.
Yeah, I could tell you enjoyed that one. That there's a lot of that in your book. I had to when I read your book, I had to have Lord of the Rings, of course. I had to have the letters, and I had to have that book out to do some cross
Right, right.
referencing. So that's the trio. Do you have a favorite chapter, maybe scene, but in the Lord of the Rings? What do you think is the great piece there?
It's funny. I love I love Tom Bombadil.
Yeah,
I absolutely love Tom Bombadil. Is one of my favorite. And one of the things, and I love it. Actually, one of the reasons why I love it is because it seems to be completely useless to the story. It seems to be
right.
completely irrelevant, but it does those the combination of the Old Forest and the House of Tom Bombadil are just
Hmm.
so enchanting by themselves that I think that's what really drew me in when I first started reading it.
Yeah,
The Shire part's okay, interesting, maybe a little long getting going and so forth. But once I got to the Old Forest and Tom
yeah.
Bombadil, I was really. Although it's funny because I saw like a couple, there was a poster on X who hated Tom Bombadil and thought it was, and I was like, no, 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 no. To the contrary, it's one of my favorite. He's one of my favorite characters, and those are my favorite chapters.
Now, do you have a theory or any kind of suggestion on who or what you think Tom Bombadil is?
Yeah, well, I do talk about it a little bit in the book, and actually, I kind of evade it a little bit
Yeah.
because I think, well, and for I think a good reason, which is that I think Tolkien sees Tom Bombadil as someone who is so lacking in any egocentrism that he becomes a part of the landscape. He becomes part of the flora and fauna of the Old Forest and of the Barrow Downs and so forth, and that in a way he is. Uh, uh, Yeah, I mean, kind of the natural world speaks through him. He's
Hmm.
kind of, and
Yeah.
Goldberry says he is. I
He
mean,
gives it a voice. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, he is, and there's nothing else to say about him. So, and of course, Tolkien refused to say what he was.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, is he a Vala? Is he a Maya? Is he? We just don't know. He's not a hobbit. He's not a human being. He's not an elf. He is sui generis. He's just
Hmm.
someone who and I think that's what makes Tom Bombadil so special.
Yeah. Yeah. Some things are better, not completely explained. I think that's part of the magic of Tom
Yeah,
Bombadil. So
exactly.
those scenes, Tom Bombadil scenes aside, did you love the Peter Jackson movies?
Well, yeah, Peter Jackson cut out Tom Bombadil. I know, and well, actually, I understood that. I mean, I did understand that decision. I love the movies. I mean, I will just say, I love the movies. I certainly, when I first saw them, I was blown away. I was particularly blown away by how much Peter Jackson um, how well he created the atmosphere of Middle
Hmm.
Earth, of being in Middle Earth. I was also really stunned by the casting. I think the
Yeah.
casting is absolutely perfect. Of course, I had read the books long before I saw the movies, and I was absolutely astounded how close the cast looked to the characters as I had imagined them in my
Hmm.
mind. Particularly Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn. He just looked
Yeah.
exactly like I had imagined him. And of course, Ian McKellen as Gandalf and so forth. It was just it was, and so yeah, and so my family and I, we watched them every year between Christmas and New Year's. I know this is a
Ah,
very common thing.
director's
Um,
cuts, extended editions.
exactly, extended edition, only the extended edition.
Yes.
Which I think is very rarely is that the case, but it is much better than the theatrical version.
Yes.
I have my criticisms of the movie, though. I mean, and over the years, there are parts. Actually, I've kind of grown critical of some aspects of the movies. I never liked how radically they changed Faramir's character.
Yes.
And so yeah, sometimes I even skip the scenes there when I rewatched the movies.
Hmm.
And I was a little disappointed that they cut out the Scouring of the Shire, although I realized it would have made the movies way too long. But
Yeah.
the Scouring of the Shire is very essential, I think, to
Yes.
Tolkien's story. And there's like other more minor things, like making Aragorn into the reluctant hero, which is kind of a Hollywood trope,
Yeah.
which is
That's
not in
very
the which is
characteristic of our age.
yeah, which is not in the book. And so, and I have so over the years I've kind of gotten kind of nitpicky with the movies. um, but overall I still really enjoy them, and I still think they're great. But but I always tell people you really got to read the book.
Yeah, the
You know,
books are far better.
yeah,
Dare I ask you about the Amazon Rings of Power series? What you
I
think about
haven't
that?
even watched.
That says it all. That
I
says it all.
I haven't watched it. I dare not touch it. It
You're
just
not missing.
seems
You're not missing
it
much.
it seems like such a bastardization of Tolkien's lore to me that I just
Yes.
I don't even yeah.
Probably the wise decision. Last one on this. If you could assign a non-Tolkien book to understand or appreciate Tolkien, not just about Tolkien, but something to help you really dig into what he's doing, what would it be, or what has it been since you've taught this?
That's a good question. But this one I don't have a ready answer. A non-Tolkien book. So it could be anything, right? Not just a book on Tolkien, but just anything.
Like for me, I would do Beowulf. I think there's something about going back far enough to some of the things that,
Right.
and that's not the only one, but to me, it's an accessible one that people have heard of. But if you read that, certain portions of Tolkien will come alive to you that otherwise won't.
Yes. Definitely Beowulf, I would say. So yeah, I would say definitely say Beowulf. Trying to think of any other, you know, yeah, I would say Beowulf. Okay, that's Although there was a book recently what I read by Holly Ordway about
Hmm.
Tolkien's modern reading, which is a great book because she talks about all the different modern what was for Tolkien modern novels. We're talking about like late
Yes.
19th, early 20th century novels that were a big influence on him. That was really interesting. That was a really interesting book because she kind of was dismantling the myth kind of constructed by Humphrey Carpenter's bio that
Right.
Tolkien was this fuddy-duddy who only read medieval literature, didn't read anything after 1500 and so forth. And she's like, no, that's not at all the case. He
Right.
read a lot of modern fiction and like Edgar Rice Burroughs and like a whole bunch of Buchan, I think is the guy's name, and so all these a lot of these like Victorian adventure novels he really enjoyed, and that
Hmm.
actually was a big influence on the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And yeah, and she also mentions he was like although Tolkien is very critical of technology, he used an electric typewriter.
Yeah.
He unlike his friend Lewis, who never used a
Never learned
typewriter,
to type. Yeah.
never learned to type and always used a fountain pen or whatever. I mean, Tolkien was like an early he loved ballpoint pens. He used ballpoint pens all the time. Where for Lewis this was a newfangled thing. And so forth. So and also Tolkien, he kept up with he subscribed to at least three newspapers and was very up on current events.
Yes.
Unlike his friend C.S. Lewis, who
Yes.
bragged about never reading the newspaper and so forth and so on. So yeah,
Yes.
I mean, there's some interesting stuff there.
I want to zoom in on the final chapter in your book on hope. And I thought this was so powerful. It was such a great chapter to get to the heart of what Tolkien's doing and what he does for us and to us. You talk about so many themes. They come together in this sense of conquering death, true life, recovering a vision of the creation, being connected to the creation and the creator. And it centers somewhat around this theme of eucatastrophe,
Yeah,
which is a term that Tolkien talks about his work. How does Tolkien bring us to eucatastrophe, but avoid inevitability throughout the
right.
book?
Yeah, yeah. That is, of course, the most amazing thing I think about Tolkien's work is how he works eucatastrophe in his work in a way that is so unexpected and convincing. that you barely notice it, right? I mean, because it does seem to be very much rooted in reality,
Hmm.
and Tolkien emphasizes this all the time. Well, certainly he does in his essay on fairy stories, where he says, a good fantasy or fairy story has to be even more logical and more rooted in reality than, say, historical fiction or a piece of contemporary social commentary fiction or something like that. Um, and so it has to be really, it has to be very rigorous in order to establish a believable secondary world. And so I think that's what he does. And it is quite extraordinary how, as we mentioned earlier, uh, decisions that seem to be foolish or to be work against the characters, but nevertheless are rooted in what is right, what is good, well, end up saving the fellowship, saving the quest. And I think it's because for Tolkien, almost if we look at the world and look at events, uh, almost everything is rooted in eternal values that are
Hmm.
also good. I mean, ultimately, of course, God is the author of the world we live in, and of course, the writer of the fairy story is kind of like a secondary God who's kind of creating a world in a way analogous to the way that God writes the story of our primary world. And what you have is a creator who is all good and eternal. And to the degree that we abide by these eternal values, to that degree, we come to a happy ending, a eucatastrophe. And that this eucatastrophe is actually built into reality. It's not, uh, it's not something that we just kind of hope or wish. I mean, there is hope in the sense that a hope is a firm conviction that this is the case, right? That this is reality. Um, and that this eucatastrophe hope is the notion that this eucatastrophe is rooted in the world, and that the author of the world is going to bring the story of our lives and of the whole human race to a happy conclusion if, of course, we make the right decisions. Right? Of course, we can make the wrong decisions, and then we bring upon ourselves wrath, which is, Tolkien specifically says this in the essay on fairy stories. Now, of course, this also means, and this I think, and Tolkien always emphasizes this with eucatastrophe, that you cannot have eucatastrophe without sorrow and loss.
Hmm.
Right? Um, the two go together. There cannot be a eucatastrophe without great suffering and loss and sorrow and so forth, which is, of course, you see throughout his work a great melancholy um, and a great sadness, which, of course, is incredibly beautiful in a way,
Hmm.
uh, in many ways, not in a way. I mean, it's kind of this probably the main source of the great beauty of his work, and one which, and to Jackson's credit, I think he captures beautifully in his book,
Yes.
in his movies. I mean, and so yeah, so and of course, the ultimate eucatastrophe is life after death. I think
Hmm.
for Tolkien. I mean, this is, you know, and this, of course, is the great sadness of the elves, despite their supposed, superior gifts um, and their incredibly long lives compared to human beings. They live as long as Arda or the world lives. But nevertheless, they don't have a destiny beyond the world. So
Yeah.
they and so from their perspective, that human beings die is a gift to us, right?
Right.
Which of course is hard for us as human beings to understand because we envy the elves. They're, in the of course in Tolkien's secondary world, we men, envy the elves. They're supposedly charmed and much much longer lifespan. Um, but the elves, in a sense, realize that they're cut off from this eucatastrophe that only human beings have because we have a destiny beyond this particular story. There's beyond there. Actually, Tolkien thinks of paradise in many ways as stories upon stories upon stories to be told. Um, you know, I think for for Tolkien, in what I guess in the whether it's Valar, the Undying Lands, or what is beyond that, everything will pass away. I don't know, medicine, law, engineering, whatever. But poetry, song, music, stories, these will be the stuff of eternal life. That we will be creators, and that is our essence, is to be uh, artists, to be creators. Every one of us. Um, and so this is our eucatastrophe. Of course, again, the eucatastrophe cannot come about unless there is, however, a great deal of suffering and pain and loss. He even says, eucatastrophe is a joy poignant as grief. So it's kind of it's a and of course you think about it, whenever we experience incredible joy, of course we cry.
Right.
There are tears of joy, and it does. And when you think about it, I mean, it does seem to be like a indistinguishable. The great the cry cries of tears of joy and the tears of grief are in many ways interchangeable. And so yeah, so the Tolkien ignores you know, you get this line of criticism that, as you mentioned before, they're the good guys and the bad guys, and there's a supposedly happy ending, which is so unrealistic and so forth. I just don't. I don't know if these people have read Tolkien, or if they have, whether they can read. I mean, because to me, it's just evident that there is a great deal of gradation between good and evil in his world, and that the eucatastrophe is something that is only won through, great loss and grief. Um, and although ultimately the eucatastrophe redeems that grief and that loss, I think ultimately.
Hmm.
Um,
I think that's what makes it true hope. As you
yeah,
said,
yeah,
it's the non-inevitability, the rootedness in sorrow. The resurrection being the ultimate eucatastrophe has to come from death, a real death, not just
right,
a
exactly.
charade death. A real
Yeah,
death.
yeah, yeah. Is hope is not wishful thinking. Actually, the two are opposed. Um, you know, um, because throughout the Lord of the Rings, or his other work, any wishful thinking is completely demolished. That any of the characters had, all of it is demolished. They there's every time they think that they have it solved, something comes in and completely destroys their plans. They're going to go
Yes.
in through the Black Gate, and then they discover, oh, that's a no-go, and then they go up to the path of Cirith Ungol, and then you have Shelob the spider and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's and I had a thought, but I'm trying to remember, but now it's escaped me. But anyway, I think
Yes. Well, you in the book where Lord of the Rings ends, and contrasting these two fates, if you will, Frodo and Sam. Their stories end very differently because of what's happened to them. Frodo sails off, and Sam comes home, and
right,
I think the poignant last scene of Lord of the Rings, you just never get over it, where he's
right,
coming
exactly,
back and says his chair is ready and he's expected, and he sits down in the chair and says, "Well, I'm back."
right, right,
This
right,
wonderful scene, and the way you describe it at the end of the book is, with Sam, the reader attains that final serenity that
yeah,
good literature provides through Sam, not only for the reader, but in the events subsequent to the War of the Ring themselves, that we find a survey of our own story. And then you're going to quote a letter from Tolkien where he says, basically, we see our story even more when we see the whole story. It just
yeah.
seems to me like that's not just the source of hope. It seems to me like that is the true recovery. And I'll give you kind of the last word on that.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about at the very end. Actually, I have a copy of my book here. Where he says it teaches us that everything. If literature teaches us anything at all, this is of course Tolkien writing in his letters, is that we have in us an eternal element, free from care and fear, which can survey all things, can survey things that in life we call evil with serenity. Um, And so, yeah, I think it's a recovery ultimately of the eternal in us, and which has contact with or has some continuity with the eternal author
Yes.
of the world. And that ultimately the best way to understand us, and this is, I think, why, although I'm a philosopher, nevertheless, I have to say that ultimately, I think Tolkien and literature, although I hate to say this, gives us a deeper insight because ultimately I think the eternal, this serenity can only be attained through story,
Hmm.
through narrative, through story, through myth, um, through fantasy, and so forth. This is, of course, that's where philosophy ends, and what goes beyond it begins. And that, and I think I mentioned in the preface of my book that I think the philosophers that I'm attracted to recognize this.
Yes.
Plato, ends his dialogues with myths. Pascal, another philosopher whom I'm really fond of, also talks about the how philosophy has to end in scripture because it's only through these narratives that we really understand ourselves. Abstract reason with its axioms and arguments and theorems do not capture adequately the sense of our lives, and only story can do that. And we can only, I guess, and I think for Tolkien, we can only capture the sense of the story of our individual life only insofar as it is against the backdrop of the larger story of creation, and of God's working out of the great music of creation, in the story of the universe, the story of human civilization and society, and of course, our individual story. And I think for Tolkien, by creating a secondary world like Middle Earth, kind of gives us encapsulizes in a very, very digestible form this story. Um,
Yes. Well, Robert, this is masterful stuff. I enjoyed it. I encourage everybody listening to go out and get The Fantasy of J.R.R Tolkien.
Thank you,
From Robert
Cole.
Dobie, thank you so much for coming on the So We Speak podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was such a pleasure to talk about Tolkien with you.